The European media, many of which are state-funded, and leaders continue to publicly obsess over the US election. The concern stems from statements made by both the former and current president-elect regarding NATO's defense spending, or the lack thereof. Then, President Trump raised the question of whether the US should continue as a member of NATO, suggesting that non-payment could prevent the extension of Article 5, the foundation of NATO collective defense. This issue has sparked significant concern in Europe. The new NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has made it public that when it comes to defense spending, the former and future president is correct. The numbers on defense spending back the assessment. Russia seized the Crimea from Ukraine and supported an armed separatist movement in eastern Ukraine that has a high percentage of ethnic Russian Ukrainians. This action by Russia in 2014 finally shook NATO policy out of its Cold War lethargy on defense spending to deter Russia. Is the same Russia that in 2012, President Obama mocked Mitt Romney for claiming that Russia posed the greatest geopolitical threat to the United States. NATO member countries universally agreed to increase defense spending to 2% of their GDP in response to Russia's actions in Ukraine, viewing it as a geopolitical threat to European security. This new defense spending target was unanimously agreed upon by all the member countries, as is required by NATO rules requiring unanimous consent. In 2014, NATO consisted of 27 countries, and after 2014, it admitted 4 new countries, all of which agreed to the 2% of GDP defense spending target as a condition of NATO membership. 2 significant events occurred following the 2014 Russian operation and the decision to increase defense spending. The first is that the collective West did almost nothing to help Ukraine from a military perspective, as most countries wanted to avoid escalation with Russia. This is particularly evident in the swift conclusion of the operation. Lethal aid started flowing at low levels to Ukraine a couple of years after the Russian seizure of Crimea. Despite unanimous agreement, NATO member states nearly universally ignored the 2% GDP target. Weapons were not being sent to Ukraine. Rampant corruption played a part in this decision not to send aid. Russian oil and gas continued to flow into Europe, and collective defense spending in NATO fell the first year after the invasion and the first year of the new target spending. Clearly, European NATO and Canada did not take the Russian threat seriously, nor did they feel obligated to fulfill their agreed-upon obligations. NATO countries and leadership reassured themselves that they were indeed meeting the 2% of GDP goal in collective quantities, given that defense spending as a percentage of GDP has consistently exceeded 2% since the 2014 agreement. Collectively, they achieved about 2%, which they assured themselves shielded them from criticism from then-President Trump in 2017. Despite knowing they were deceiving themselves, they acted as if their honor was under threat. When excluding the US and focusing solely on Europe and Canada, NATO defense spending has fallen short of the agreed-upon 2% GDP target for 10 out of 11 years, ultimately reaching 2.02% of GDP in 2024. When accounting for the US, NATO consistently contributes to GDP, reaching 2.71% in 2024. However, the agreement required each individual country in NATO to contribute 2% of their GDP, rather than a collective one. Since the spending agreement has been made, only 3 countries have met it every year since 2014: United States, United Kingdom, Greece. There are 2 countries that have met the 2% target since joining NATO. Finland, Sweden 2024 will see the largest number of NATO countries making the GDP, with 24 of 31 nations meeting the target, or 77% participation. While this is encouraging, it should be noted that the agreement is in its 11th year. The individual measure of NATO countries reaching the goal for each of those 11 years is only 27%, and prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, that rate was only 19%. NATO countries that have failed to meet their spending targets in 2024 and have not done so since 2014: Belgium, Canada, Italy, Luxembourg, Portugal, Slovenia, Spain. NATO countries that have never met spending targets until 2024: Albania, Croatia, Czechia, Germany, Montenegro, Netherlands, North Macedonia, Norway, Romania, Slovak Republic. Turkey. French President Emmanuel Macron has been urging Europe to prioritize defense, advocating for a defense, security-independent Europe that does not rely on the US for its protection. This new European security aspiration, modeled after Gaullism, will be led by France, the same France that has only twice fulfilled its GDP commitment. The first time was in 2020, and the second time was in 2024. Neither President Trump nor the new Secretary General Rutte's criticism should cause the collective state of Europe to be angry. Mr. Rutte has publicly stated that Europe should increase its defense spending, and that President Trump's criticism was valid. Admittedly, Mr. Rutte has been more diplomatic in his criticism, and he has also made it clear to European leaders that he has a positive view of being able to effectively work with the upcoming administration. Mr. Rutte is aligning himself with what all countries have unanimously agreed upon, not with the largest NATO country and superpower. The Munich-based IFO Institute released a report earlier this month stating that not only do European NATO countries and Canada need to spend on their 2% GDP target, but they also have a deficit to make up. Germany, Italy, and Spain have the largest deficit, but the fact that NATO, including the US, has only a 27% compliance rate reinforces the point that there is a significant deficit that requires a higher level of defense spending if Europe wants to deter Russia and, in the French model, to do so without the United States. The problem lies in NATO's lack of a mechanism to enforce adherence to the 2% GDP target. The responsibility fell on individual countries, and all but 3, the US, UK, and Greece, failed to fulfill their obligations. If the US and Secretary Rutte need to publicly call out, shame, or cajole these countries for not meeting their obligations, it is reasonable to expect President-elect Trump and Secretary Rutte to do so. Secretary Rutte has stated that this is the only approach available. The challenge for both parties is that while the US can threaten to leave NATO and publicly shame countries that fail to honor commitments, Europe remains a vital interest of the US, a fact that European leaders are well aware of. The European leaders' willingness to buy into the hyperbolic statements from the US reflects their inability to properly understand the geopolitical position of US and European common interests. The question that European and Canadian NATO leaders should be asking themselves is, why do they even want to be in NATO if they don't want to contribute equally for security? Should countries that fail to meet their commitments receive payment transfers from compliant countries to ensure that everyone is on target? Should they be disqualified from receiving defense alliance protections? NATO members, especially those who fail to honor their commitments, will veto payment transfers or reduced alliance privileges because NATO cannot change rules without unanimous consent. The European Union has representatives attend NATO conferences. Perhaps the EU can take a more active role, not in trying to create a military, but in enforcing compliance on states that are both in the EU and NATO. The argument posits that the EU security relies on NATO, and countries opposing an EU army should exert pressure on EU members to comply, thereby preventing the EU from justifying the formation of an army. Both sides could use the EU threat to their advantage. Comply to protect the EU, and comply to keep the EU from gaining traction to take over European security by supplanting the individual member states' role in the defense realm. The US and the EU can use their combined economic power to induce non-EU NATO countries into compliance, such as Canada. The other non-EU NATO countries are currently in compliance. Non-EU countries in NATO: Albania, Canada, Iceland, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Norway, Turkey, United Kingdom, United States. These are merely potential suggestions to enforce compliance on NATO countries in the event that public pressure fails, and they should not be construed as all-encompassing solutions. The idea is that we can propose alternative approaches to achieve compliance. Removing the 2% GDP requirement would worsen the security situation in Europe and face opposition from the US, UK, Greece, and Secretary Rutte. European leaders need to stop their fearmongering grandstanding over the mean man across the Atlantic and find solutions to prevent the worst impulses they fear, which should not be too hard since they all agreed to the solution 11 years ago.